humanist perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello again. I'm Harry Greenberger. Happy to have you on as our guest, as our audience today. And I have two guests with me. One of them being Michael Mitchell, who is a New Orleans attorney. He's also a neighbor of mine and a longtime friend of mine, along with Marjorie Esman, who is the executive director of the Louisiana ACLU. And Marjorie, we've known each other a long time also.
Long time.
Well, the topic today came about because Michael Mitchell said to me on an occasion, he said, "Did you know that the colleges have banned words that they don't allow students to use?" And that was news to me. I had never heard about that. And I asked Michael, I said, well, is that something you'd like to come on the show and talk about? Because we secular humanists certainly would be concerned about people having their rights violated. And so that's why I asked you to come on the show, and you said, well, let's get some additional help and we'll get Marjorie Esman with us. So either one of you, tell us what it is that's going on.
Harry, the area of interest falls into what colleges are calling speech codes or civility codes or even anti-harassment policies. There's certainly nothing wrong with having an anti-harassment policy. You need to have one, especially if it's something like sexual harassment or racial harassment.
You define harassment.
That's the problem. So many of them are so vaguely written and so poorly written that they chill free speech to an alarming degree. And yes, there are a handful of cases where specific words have been found to be in violation of one of these codes. Let me give you a couple of examples to kind of set the stage.
Okay.
At Brandeis University, a professor was found guilty of racial harassment and a monitor was placed in his classroom because he used the word wetbacks. Now, that's an offensive word, but let me put it in context. He was explaining to the class where the term had originated and cautioning them not to use it. But he used it in that explanation, and the university found him guilty of harassment.
Well, had the university previously had a list of banned words and that was one of them, or did this come as a surprise?
That came as a surprise to him. Okay. It also came as a surprise to an employee of William Patterson University whose name is Jihad Daniel. I didn't make that up. That's his name. He received an unsolicited mass email from a professor, Professor Scala, promoting a film about a lesbian relationship. That wasn't a violation, but he responded privately with an email saying, please don't send me any more emails about Connie and Sally or Adam and Steve. He was charged with sexual harassment for having said that to Professor Scala. A third example that I'll give.
I'm still trying to absorb that one.
Okay.
It's hard to see how that could be
Yeah,
sexual harassment.
the offense was using those two names, two female and two male, and that was offense. But now, had the university, did they have a list of offenses?
You can't list words like Connie and Sally or Adam and Steve. Their theory was that it was mocking a lesbian relationship or mocking a gay relationship
and what
to
sort
say.
of penalties do these
And
people?
even if it were, and that's a different issue, how that becomes sexual harassment, I think, is a stretch. I mean, it might be something else. You can call it something else, and you can decide whether or not to ban that kind of, as you described, mocking, which I don't agree with anyway. But I don't know how you can turn that into sexual harassment.
Neither do I.
And what sort of penalty went along with that? Do you know?
He was charged with sexual harassment. There was a hearing. He was ultimately acquitted. But he had to go to the trouble of hiring lawyers to defend himself. And so much of this has what we would call a chilling effect on free speech. He'll certainly think twice before he responds in that manner again. And again, nobody is condoning rudeness. It's not good to be impolite. It's all of that sort of stuff. But that's in a social setting. That's breaking the rules of etiquette to be rude to someone. It's not against the law.
You would think not.
A large part of the problem here, I mean, there are lots of problems, but a large part of the problem is the vagueness of these codes, because if you can't provide a list of thou shalt not utter the following words, then at least people know what they're not allowed to say. Now, I would have problems with it even if there were such a list, but if you don't even know what you're not allowed to say, how do you know that you're not allowed to say it? And you know, that sort of fundamental principle of First Amendment law in this country is that you can't punish somebody for saying something that they didn't know they weren't allowed to say.
Agreed. And so you find out on a case-by-case basis when someone says you stepped over the line. Well, we've got one word that would go on that list as wetbacks. Another word is hate.
What's that, hate?
Hate. The college Republicans on Gonzaga were disciplined because they posted flyers that contained the word hates in the title. And
What did the flyer say?
the flyer said, we would like to welcome and invite you to a speech. Our upcoming speaker's book is called Why the Left Hates America. They put the title of the book in the title of the flyer, and using the word hate in the title of a flyer at Gonzaga violated their rules.
Why? I mean, what was the justification for that?
You're not allowed to hate.
Oh, you're not allowed.
And do you
And you're not
know?
allowed to talk about the fact that somebody else hates.
I guess not.
Are you allowed to hate the concept of hate?
You've exactly crystallized the problem. It leads you down the rabbit hole to have these speech codes to say, well, you can't say something that offends me. And if I say that to you, it might offend you.
And,
Well, let me see if I understand. These examples you gave me were kind of formal, but suppose a student speaking to another student on campus uses the word hate. Is that subject to some sort of penalty?
We have to assume that at Gonzaga, it might.
So if you were to say, you know, oh, I hate Professor so-and-so because, you know, the tests are too hard. If you don't agree with me, I suppose I could be offending you because you don't agree that Professor so-and-so's tests are too hard. You actually are doing very well in the class and you happen to be very, you know, stimulated by this professor. Then I guess what? Then I've violated your right not to hate this person?
And if someone overheard that conversation, they would report it to the school. And then what? Then the school. What does the school do to the person?
Well, it depends, of course. If it's a professor, they may just be chastised. They may be formally reprimanded. They may, as this one professor suffered, have a monitor placed in their classroom. But if you think about it, in the real world, You don't even want to be scolded by someone like the dean of the college. If you're a professor and the dean says, you know, I don't like that word used in our classrooms, if you're up for tenure, you're not going to use that word, even though it's not illegal.
And yet, you know, all of this, when taken to its logical conclusion, can be turned upside down on itself. I mean, if, you know, the example you just gave, the dean says, you know, Mike, I don't like it when you use the word whatever.
Illegal aliens,
illegal
because
aliens.
that's an example.
And you can say, but it hurts my feelings that you just told me you don't like what I said.
Yeah, right.
And where does it stop? And then the dean says, but you know, it hurts my feelings that you're being disrespectful to me. I mean, where does it stop? So then nobody can ever say anything.
Right.
Illegal aliens is one of those banned words?
Yes, it is.
Well, I hear it on TV 100 times a day.
Well, but you don't hear it at Washington State University.
I understand that this is a different thing, but it all sounds so irrational to me.
Well, I think it's irrational, and I think it's also counterproductive. The whole purpose of or one of the main purposes of a college education or going to a university is to expand your mind, not close it, to be exposed to new ideas, different ideas, things you hadn't thought of before, things that make you uncomfortable. And to say, no, you can't ever hear anything that's uncomfortable is self-censorship of the worst kind.
And it also, in addition to that, and I agree with all of that, that it's antithetical to what is supposed to be the purpose of higher education, or any kind of education, really. But it also really, I hate to use the word discriminate, but that's the only word that's coming to my mind now, against a set of beliefs that don't conform with what the administration wants conveyed. And so if you're sort of on the minority side of these issues, then you're not allowed to express yourself.
Right.
So it's shutting down a particular viewpoint. Although, as I say, you know, those people who are being shut down, you know, if, for instance, you want to talk about illegal aliens and you mean you want to talk about them as illegal aliens because, you know, maybe, you know, you support Donald Trump for president and you really think that we should deport everybody who doesn't have a visa to be here. You know, and you've chosen those words deliberately, you ought to be able to express that opinion. And then other people can disagree with you. And then maybe somebody can persuade somebody else, or maybe you agree to disagree.
That's what free speech is all about, right there.
All right. Well, now, you gave instances from a number of colleges or universities, but I didn't hear any of the big names of universities in there. Are some of the major universities doing the same kind of censorship?
Sure, and let's focus in on the problem of vagueness that Marjorie mentioned earlier. Let's look at LSU.
Yeah.
The LSU has a document called Living on Campus, and the Living on Campus handbook states any form of harassment is prohibited. This can include behaving in a manner that is offensive.
And if they don't define offensive, how does anybody know what's going to offend somebody else?
It's not.
No, but behaving is not the same thing as speaking, is it?
Well, it can be, because, you know, speech is really expression, and expression can be nonverbal communication as well. It can be the clothes that you wear, it can be performance, it can be all sorts of things. Now, you know, running down the dormitory hall at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're drunk, banging on other people's dorms, it's reasonable to restrict that. You know, yes, that might be offensive, and yes, it's reasonable to restrict that. That's sort of analogous to disturbing the peace. But to just say that you can't behave in a manner that is offensive, if I don't know what somebody else thinks is offensive, how do I know how I'm not supposed to behave?
Well, but we are talking about banned words.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but conduct is really subsumed in that.
LSU Have there been any instances of words that caused a problem?
I don't have an example for LSU, but you do have to focus in on when we're talking about things like behavior and clothing. There's a difference between a public university and a private university. You know, I'm an employment lawyer, and a lot of employees are surprised to find out that they don't have a right of free speech in a private workplace. If an employer wants to say, I'm banning a certain word, they can certainly do that. I'll give you a good example. I've got several clients who have banned certain forms of dress, including a Confederate flag. If you come to work wearing a Confederate t-shirt, Confederate belt buckle, or whatever, you take it off or you're sent home. And a lot of times employees hear that and say, but wait a minute, this is a free country. I can say whatever I want. Well, out in public you can.
You can, but not at work.
Right. If you want to raise the Confederate flag in front of your house, have at it. But not in this workplace. You can't.
But those same rules would actually apply in a public workplace as long as there's no viewpoint discrimination. I mean, you know, a governmental workplace could just as easily say you can't wear a Confederate flag to work, but then you also can't wear some other kind of slogan. You know, that you can't engage in viewpoint discrimination, but you can ban all of it. You know, we've seen that come up, those sorts of things come up. Particularly, this was a problem after the election of President Obama to his first term. There were issues of schools telling kids that they couldn't talk about President Obama. You know, so what are they going to do? Go 4 years or maybe 8 years and never mention the name of the President of the United States because the principal doesn't like him? I mean, you know, that's ridiculous. But, you know, you do have rules that can prohibit any kind of slogan on a T-shirt, those kinds of things.
What about an example from Marquette, which defines harassment as verbal conduct directed at a person which could result in emotional discomfort? That is incredibly vague. And let me give you an example. You take a controversial issue like abortion. If you and I are having a conversation and I say, you know, Harry, I'm a right to lifer and I think abortion is murder. You may agree, you may disagree, but you're not going to be emotionally wounded. But if I say that to a woman who's had an abortion and agonized over it, if I say, you know, I just think you murdered your baby, no doubt I have created emotional discomfort. I've been rude, I've been thoughtless, all of those things. But I haven't violated any law. On Marquette I have, because I've created emotional discomfort.
Yeah.
Well, and if you take that one step further, if you say that to a woman who may have had an abortion sometime back and you don't know it, because after all, it's one of the most private things a person can do, and if she doesn't tell you, how would you know? Then how could you know that she is going to suffer some discomfort from you saying something that you have no way of knowing that was a personal experience for her?
But even if I knew it, and I did it because I wanted to be cruel, does that mean that I don't have a right to say it, or that I should be censored, I should be forbidden from saying it, especially in a college atmosphere?
I have a question. Do you know of any instances where people who were so reprimanded filed a lawsuit saying their rights were violated?
I can't cite a specific instance of that, but I know that the ACLU around the country has litigated these kinds of speech codes for many years and generally won. Sometimes it's just to strike them down altogether. Of course, it would be at public institutions, not private institutions, but there have been lawsuits over these speech codes. Now, we haven't done that here in Louisiana. It's never been brought to our attention on campus. I mean, we have had issues with other kinds of, sometimes governments try and do this too. I mean, the New Orleans City Council years ago tried to introduce an ordinance that would have prohibited, hanging a banner from your house that would be offensive to somebody else. And one of the council people brought that to me for my approval, and I said, "Are you crazy?" No. So I can't cite a specific instance, but there has been litigation over these codes, and generally it's successful, but only in the context of a public institution and not the private
I
institutions.
understand, but when you refer to them as codes, someone established the code, and we're talking about colleges and universities. Do you know some others that have some kind of code as to acceptable words?
That has been, well, to go back to your earlier question about are there lawsuits out there? Yes, plenty of them.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to bore your listeners by reading off citations, but they're available on request if you would like them.
These were lawsuits against someone who tried to prevent them from using a word?
Yes, there are lawsuits against institutions who tried to prevent an individual from.
Who has been?
Or, for instance, it could also, the kind of quasi-litigation could come up, for instance, in the context of that student who had to defend himself against a charge of sexual harassment, and he prevailed. It probably wasn't litigation, it was probably an internal administrative hearing.
It was a hearing, yes.
But these things tend not to survive challenges.
That's the remarkable thing to me, is that these vague codes are illegal. The banning of words are illegal. And when the ACLU or there's another group, it's called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, F-I-R-E. They bring actions like this all the time and always win. They always win. FIRE has a 100% record. And yet the codes continue. It's insane, and there's something going on here, and I think it's cultural. I think it's part of, we're raising a generation that wants to be protected from everything. They want to be protected from losing at a soccer game, and so you don't keep score, and they think they have a right never to have their feelings hurt. I don't think there is such a right.
I'm trying in my own mind to determine whether this is a matter involving liberal type politics or the conservative type. Who is it the hard right people who like these bans on words, or where is this coming from?
Quite the opposite.
It's the liberals.
Yeah.
And yet, yeah, but as I say, this is ultimately going to implode because, if you take it to its logical conclusion, if I'm not allowed to use the word hate on campus because that implies, a negative emotion, what happens if, if I call Mike a racist because he says something that I think uses racist terminology. Let's say he, uses the term illegal alien, and I say, no, that's a racist term. You're not allowed to say that because it hurts my feelings because that's, an offensive racist term. He could say, well, it hurts my feelings that you think I'm a racist, and you're not allowed to call me a racist because it hurts my feelings that you shut down my speech.
Yes.
So, it becomes cyclical, and then nobody can say anything. But it's also an example of what I call the sort of, becoming so left you're right, and then the right becoming so left, so right that they're left, and they kind of somewhere meet in the middle. I mean, there's something very almost Puritan about this.
Well, the Puritans really caused a lot of problems in settling this country.
They did, and there's something very almost Puritan or sort of Victorian about this.
I agree with that
in a way.
100%. But the fact of the matter is, most college professors lean left, most college administrators lean left, and these rules are well intentioned to prevent sexual harassment and racial harassment and hurt feelings and those sorts of things, but they are basically coming from the left against the right.
Well, now, if this is as prevalent as it appears to be, why have I not seen or heard anything in the media about it? Or have I just missed it?
there are stories about this from time to time. It comes up, and in fact, I was just telling Mike the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly happens to have an article about this. I don't know why they chose to do it or chose to do it now, but it just happens that there's an article about this in the current issue of Atlantic Monthly. But you do now and again see stories about it, but I think there is this sort of tendency to not even want to talk about the fact that this is a problem because you don't want to hurt the feelings of the people who are creating the problem. And it all comes down to really the answer to what is considered bad speech always needs to be more speech, not less speech. You don't solve a problem by shutting up the speaker. You solve a problem by having more speakers.
You would think that people on TV and radio would be greatly concerned about this restrictions on speech. But as I say, I haven't heard this discussed in the media.
Well, it also tends to come up on kind of right-wing talk radio because it is, as Mike said, it tends to be promulgated by liberal thinking people and tends to have its greatest impact on those who are considered conservative. And so the conservative talk radio, they play it up a lot.
Whereas on the mainstream media, they do tend to lean left and probably don't think it's a problem.
Yes. How did this come to your attention, Michael?
I don't recall. I don't recall. But the thing that I mentioned earlier, that it's found to be illegal time and time again, and yet it seems to be increasing. The latest trend, the most recent trend that I found, is coming up with phrases that are called, they're not totally banned, but they're frowned on because they are microaggressions. It is mildly aggressive and therefore discouraged, which chills free speech, to say things like, "Where are you from?" A person asking an Asian American or Latino American to teach them words in their native language. That's not a good idea. I would think that's a great idea.
I would think that would be a very friendly thing.
I suppose you'd have to take that one step further and know that the person you're speaking with actually is bilingual in another language.
Yes.
If you don't know that, somebody can have a Latin name and maybe their family's been in this country for 6 generations and they may not speak a word of any other language besides English.
But it's not insulting to ask them that.
But certainly if you have reason to believe that they are conversant in another languge, then I would consider that to be complimentary.
I think it's friendly. It's absolutely friendly. Things like the myth of meritocracy. You're not supposed to say, "I believe the most qualified person should get the job," or "men and women have equal opportunities for achievement," or "America is the land of opportunity." That's frowned on.
Wow. Well, listen, our time is up.
Okay.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you, folks who are watching our show. As you know, we can be seen on various areas on the internet, and of course here on Channel 76 with Cox Cable. Be with us again.